Hello everyone, this is part 1 of What If Naruto Passed the Genin Test. This story is made by 50 Chaos, and I hope you guys enjoy this video and to like, to subscribe, to share, and check out the playlist, to see more comment down below. Now let's start the intro.
They call me a god. They call me a god. They call me a god.
Join my membership, the perks are great. It's in the description. Be sure to like and subscribe, it gives me more motivation. Enjoy. Uzumaki Naruto, called the instructor's voice. Out of the long string of 11 and 12-year-olds stepped one blonde, the smallest, and the only one wearing bright orange. He walked in a straight line along the sun-baked dirt that made up the training field to the place marked with an X in front of the instructor, who happened to be Iruka. Please Naruto, thought Iruka, please pass this time, for both our sakes. Naruto, said Iruka, I want you to try and transform into the Hokage. Naruto looked around, from Iruka, to the academy building behind Iruka, to the strange ninja standing off by the schoolyard gate wearing half a mask and a Seiei forehead protector, and breathed a small sigh. Why does there have to be an audience for this? Naruto wondered, looking beyond the silver-haired ninja to the second man standing farther back. This more concealed character wore clothes stranger than the first, a jet black cloak that hid him from shoulder to toe, and a swirled orange mask with an opening for only one eye. Despite the fact that he and Iruka had been practicing this transformation for days on end, Naruto still couldn't quite get it right. Something always seemed to go wrong, but nevertheless he formed the familiar seal of the ram and shouted, Henge. There was a loud puff, and a puff of smoke, which the wind blew away, revealing an almost exact copy Sarutobi. Almost. The spiky blonde hair that erupted where the Hokage's hat should have been ruined the effect and brought uproarious laughter from the crowd of children. Iruka sighed and put his fingers on his nose, rubbing slightly at the scar. Naruto. The boy released the jutsu and stepped back, begging Iruka for one more chance. Please Iruka-sensei, Naruto said, putting his hands together and staring at Iruka with watering eyes. This was his fourth time failing, and one more letdown would be more than he could handle. Please, I know I can do it this time. Naruto, you know I see a. Please give him another chance, Iruka-sensei, called a voice from the crowd. Everyone turned to look at the source, Yamanaka Ino, who quickly blushed. The little blonde girl slapped one hand over her mouth as her cheeks reddened. She stammered, vying for some composure and slowly letting her hand drop down to her side. What possible harm could it do? He hasn't passed yet, so why not let him try? She glanced at Naruto out of the corner of her eye, wiping a blonde lock of hair from her face as a small smile tugged at one corner of her mouth. Naruto looked at her curiously, seeing his head off to one side. She hadn't complimented him, that much was certain, but at the same time there was no disdain in her voice. She wanted him to have another chance, or so it seemed. Naruto didn't understand it. Uchiha Sasuke shook his head, ruffling his raven hair, and stared off towards the north. What a couple of morons, he thought. I want to, Iruka thought wearily, and why not? He deserves another chance. He wants to be a ninja more than anyone here. Okay Naruto, called Iruka, one chance and one only. But this is going to be more of a challenge. I want you to transform into Nara Shikamaru. Naruto, Sasuke, and Shikamaru all looked at Iruka. Great, now I get to be made a fool of, thought Shikamaru. Sasuke glanced between Iruka and Naruto, just as Naruto glanced between Sasuke and Iruka. I realize that Sasuke, Uchiha Sasuke, already performed the transformation, said the Chunin, but it should prove a challenge, seeing as how you were not told to practice it, Naruto. Do you think you're up to it? I see, thought Shikamaru. Naruto glared at the Uchiha across the field. I'll show you, he whispered to himself as he formed the ram once again. Naruto closed his eyes and sparks of blue shot from his fingers as he yelled, Henge, and erupted into a cloud of smoke. For a minute, no one moved. There was no wind to clear the smoke now, so anticipation began to build. Naruto, asked Iruka after another quiet moment passed without any signs of the blonde. Iruka-sensei, called an almost raspy voice from inside the cloud as a silhouette began to take shape. How's this? Asked a perfect copy of Shikamaru stepping from the mist. Do I pass? Iruka almost leapt up, even going so far as to crouch, ready to burst out for joy, but quickly regained his composure and walked forward to inspect the technique. Everyone sat silent, and the masked ninja turned away towards the center of town. Shikamaru smiled, and Sasuke pretended not to notice. Ino looked on and tried not to smile, but failed, then turned to look at Sasuke. She looked over the raven-haired Uchiha, but glanced back at Naruto as Iruka inspected him, and nearly squealed with girlish delight at the Uzumaki's success. Hyuga Hinata merely pressed her fingers together and looked at the ground while trying to think of something to do to keep anyone from noticing she was blushing. Good, muttered Iruka trying to sound casual as he inspected Naruto's henge. Well, I'm impressed, perhaps even better than Sasuke's was earlier. Sasuke snapped his vision on Iruka, but then resumed staring off into space as though nothing had happened, while Sakura was slightly more vocal. Are you kidding? Shouted the young Haruno. Sasuke-kun's was way better than that cheap imitation. Iruka ignored the remark as Sasuke glared at Sakura, silencing her immediately. Ha! Yelled Naruto, puffing back to himself and pointing a finger enthusiastically at Sasuke, hear the duck butt. Iruka-sensei said mine was better and OWW. Iruka slapped Naruto on the back of the head and told him to be quiet or fail. Duck butt, thought nearly every student in line, turning or leaning to look at Sasuke, hair. SC. Back in the classroom, Iruka settled everyone into their seats, took his place at the front of the class, and promptly began to congratulate the 9 students who passed the exam while consoling the 20-some who could try again next time. But by the time he got past the congratulation part, Naruto had become so wrapped up in his actually passing to notice when Iruka called his name. Needless to say, the eraser soon hurled by the angry teacher found its way to Naruto's forehead with no resistance. It connected with a thunk. Now, continued Iruka, those of you who passed have been divided up into teams which I will now read off. All eyes turned to the front. This was what they all wanted to know. These teams were essentially for life, and no one wanted to miss a minute of it. Team 7, Haruno Sakura, Uchiha Sasuke, Naruto Uzumaki. Sakura at first nearly jumped up to cheer, but realization quickly set in and suddenly wasn't sure whether to applaud or cry. Sure she was with Sasuke, but Naruto. Was it worth it? Ino glared down at Sakura from her seat and brooded until her name was called for Team 9, along with Shikamaru and Akamaiki-chuji. SC. Naruto bounded towards his apartment, chanting to himself that he was one step closer to being Hokage and that he had beaten Sasuke good, and that now Sakura was sure to notice him, and all kinds of self-assuring statements, stopping every few yards to declare to the bystanders that he was going to be a ninja now and that they probably never saw that coming. Most of them just ignored him, some huffed and turned up their noses, but no one really paid him the attention. Ino walked quickly home, which was only a block from the academy, and went inside to greet her mother who was standing at the kitchen table over a roast that could feed a family twice the size of the Yamanakas. You're home early, Ino, said the woman, is everything all right? Yes mother, replied Ino warmly, the exam was today. Oh, and how did you do might I ask? Asked her mother. I passed, but I didn't make it onto Sasuke's team. Mrs. Yamanaka put a hand on Ino's shoulder and said she was sorry. It's not as bad as I thought it would be, but still, sighed Ino. How many others passed? 8 besides me, said Ino, including Naruto. Mrs. Yamanaka raised an eyebrow and chuckled a little. That's impressive, well why don't you invite him to dinner? What? Asked a very shocked Ino, I mean why? Why not? Said her mother, I mean he's failed several years in a row, and this could be a nice way to say congratulations on finally passing. Plus have you seen where he lives and what he eats? Everyone needs a good meal once in a while. Ino thought for a minute and then said, yeah, I think I will, but father hates Naruto and says I should too. Don't worry sweetie, father won't be home till late tonight, so I don't think he'll mind if we don't let him know. SC. By the time he arrived at his own door, Naruto was almost too excited to notice the note that was taped there, but he spared it off and dashed inside, going to the kitchen and taking the single, cracked bowl out of the poorly hung cabinet. He set the note aside without opening it and took out a pan from under the D-sping sink. Filling it with water, Naruto set the pan on the stove and turned on the gas, not noticing the lack of the igniter's clicking. He sat at the table and picked up the note, breaking the wax seal, flipping it open. Scanning it revealed that he was invited to dinner at the Yamanaka house at 7 p.m., roughly 2 hours from now, and that it was their treat. He thought for a minute and looked over at the bowl and the unopened ramen pack and decided he didn't really want to, and that it was probably just a trick so that Ino's father could try to hit him with yet another kunai. It was then that he noticed something, two things actually. One was the smell of gas, lots of gas, and the second was the lack of flame under the pot of water on the stove. He quickly got up and turned off the stove to stop any more gas from filling the room, and walked up to the window and opened it. There was no breeze to pull out the fumes, so Naruto walked to the light switches on the wall and flipped the one for the fan to get the air moving. He had never used it before, as he wanted to keep the electric bill down, but the fumes were horrible and burning his eyes. Just as he moved the switch, he looked up and noticed the copper wire running from the switch to the fan was badly frayed as it reached the ceiling. "Oh," he muttered as a spark leapt from the faulty wiring. Passers-by Naruto's apartment were knocked to the ground by a shockwave, and as a massive fireball exploded out the window of the housing complex on the edge of Konoha. Naruto sat against the wall covering his ringing ears and trying to catch the breath the explosion had knocked out of him. He opened one eye and looked around what had been his kitchen and living room. Fortunately there was not much to burn. The only furniture, a decrepit couch which served as his bed, was now a smoldering pile of splintered wood, and as the structure was made of concrete and the wallpaper had been burned up quickly, there was no real damage to the building. He got up a minute later, and dusted down his blackened clothes, then decided to have a look in his closet. The doors had been blown in, but his meager wardrobe was in acceptable condition. "Maybe I will take the Yamanakas up on their offer," he muttered to himself. I can't believe it, I just won't believe it, Sakura thought to herself as she meandered down the street towards her home in the northern quadrant of town. How could I get stuck with Naruto? I mean, sure, I'm on Sasuke's team, but with Naruto. It's just not fair. Who made that stupid roster anyway? She continued her mental tirade for some minutes, completely unaware that it had been the Hokage and her future sensei who has assigned her to her team, until she passed her street, and come to a far less populated section of Konoha. In fact, she would have continued on if not for the symbol painted on the building in front of her which caught her attention, the Uchiha crest. "Wow, did I take a wrong turn?" she muttered. She turned to leave, until she heard the clang of metal striking metal from around a corner, and a voice. It was Sasuke's voice, she realized, and she, fearing he was in a fight, promptly bounded off to see if he was all right. As she turned the corner and passed under an arch, she was suddenly in the middle of a garden of well-manicured grass and randomly placed stones as tall as herself. Around each stone was a small moat of raked sand, and in each moat there were dozens of kunai, along with a small wooden disc with a dot in the center, a target. In the middle of it all was Sasuke, so absorbed in flinging ninja stars at a small man-shaped target that moved on a system of ropes and pulleys that he seemingly failed to notice her intrusion. Before she could even say hello, Sasuke leapt up into the air and flipped upside down and around. While he was no less than 20 feet up, he jerked around in a circle and flung out his arms, spraying a hail kunai out in all directions. Some stuck into the target's rope to the rocks, some collided in midair to change course and whizzed towards the targets hidden by the rocks. The vast majority, however, merely thudded harmlessly into the sand. One stray flew straight towards Sakura, barely missing her torso and passing between her arm and side because she sidestepped just in time to save herself. She spun around and planted her back against the exterior wall, trying not to gasp from shock. It was nearly a minute before she peeked around the corner to see what had become of Sasuke's training. He just stood there, arms locked at his sides and growling. It seemed almost as if tears were welling in his eyes, though at a glance they seemed foggy and distant. Sakura looked around and saw that almost none of the kunai had made their mark, but those that did were in the bullseye entirely. Sasuke raised his arm and flung one last kunai at a rock to his left. With a loud thud, it buried itself almost an inch into the stone. "Sasuke-kun," said Sakura coming out from behind the entryway, "are you?" "Go home," said Sasuke, turning to stare at her. His eyes were as dark as ever, but now sharp and clear, almost animalistic. When one trains to K, it's best he be left alone. SC. Naruto stood in front of the small house attached to a flower shop, barely a block from the academy, and glanced at the address by the front window. He looked down at the note and read the address, then looked back up at the house again. He repeated the process 2 or 3 more times before he mustered the nerve to go up and knock on the door. When nothing happened for more than a minute, Naruto considered going home, thinking that it must be some kind of prank. It wouldn't be the first time someone played him that way before. But as he turned to leave, the door opened and a relatively short woman with bleached blonde hair and turquoise eyes stepped out, followed by the pleasant aroma of wildflowers. "Good evening, Mrs. Yamanaka," said Naruto, making a rare attempt at being polite. "Thank you for inviting me. I wouldn't have had you anywhere else tonight," said the woman kindly. "It really is our pleasure, but please do come in." Naruto was surprised by the display of kindness, and was even more surprised when he stepped over the threshold and Mr. Yamanaka wasn't there to throw something at him. His hand instinctively went to the spot on the back of his head where he'd been struck by the man. "What's the matter?" asked Mrs. Yamanaka, noticing the gesture. Naruto immediately put his hand back down at his side and said, "Nothing." "You're a little early," said the woman, looking at the clock which read 5:45, and guiding Naruto, after he took off his sandals, to a couch in the small, but comfortable living room. "Dinner isn't entirely ready, and Ino is working in the garden. You could go say hello if you wanted. She might appreciate the company." Again, Naruto was shocked. Most parents screamed when he came near their children, and never had he been invited to actually play or spend time with anyone, excepting Iruka and Sarutobi. No thank you," said Naruto, not entirely sure how to react. "I wouldn't want to intrude or interrupt anything." Mrs. Yamanaka shrugged, turned to face the small table, and began arranging flowers in a vase on the otherwise unadorned stand. "You're too polite," she said. It was obvious from her voice that the smile hadn't faded from her face. Why is she being so nice? Naruto wondered as he watched for a minute, and then asked, "How long have you been a flower person?" Trying to fill the somewhat awkward silence that had pervaded the room. She chuckled a little, turned around and shrugged again. "Well," she began, "I've been a florist, pretty much since before I can remember. My side of the family has tended Konoha's gardens for years. It's just what we do, plant seeds, nurture the saplings and sprouts, and promote life in general." At that moment a door in the kitchen opened and Ino walked in carrying a small paper sack, and set it on the kitchen table beside a large slab of pork roast. "Mother," she called, "we were out of ginger so I took some from the garden. Is that okay?" Mrs. Yamanaka said yes, and then looked at Naruto. "But really," she began, "how did the exam go? I heard you passed, and I heard you did it in style." Naruto instantly brightened. I did," Naruto said loudly. "Iruka-sensei told me to henjin to Shikamaru and I did. I made a perfect copy and put Sasuke to shame and everyone was staring and thinking I was awesome." Mrs. Yamanaka sat and listened, smiling as Naruto recalled the 5-minute span 100 different ways as the minutes began to roll by unnoticed. Occasionally she nodded or seed her head off to one side and said, "Really?" Naruto was more than happy just keep talking as the time rolled by, and she was more than happy to listen, though she knew he was embellishing quite a bit. Ino stood in the kitchen, chopping up some green herb and sprinkling it over a bowl of soup. She was listening in, and rolling her eyes at most of the storytelling, and when Naruto mentioned shaming Sasuke, she nearly marched in and told him to can it, though something stopped her. At the same time though, he was entertaining. The comically exaggerated facts made for a funny story, and more than once she chuckled, not at Naruto as all of the other academy students did, but with him. The story, however, couldn't last forever, and some time later the boy stopped talking, not because he wanted to mind you, but because his tea was so dry that he literally couldn't say another word. His mouth kept moving, and his hands kept illustrating the story, but no sounds escaped him. Ino noticed as his voice became raspier and drier, and when he finally stopped she looked around the corner to see what the matter was. When she saw him miming the day's events to her mother, she almost cracked up and lost it. It was the funniest thing she'd seen all day, aside maybe from the blonde Sarutobi, or Sasuke's hair after Naruto pointed out. She stopped and glared at Naruto, only then realizing just how much he had insulted the Uchiha, and that was something she would not tolerate. "No one insults Sasuke and gets away with it while I'm around," she thought to herself, as she reached into one of the cabinets and pulled out some ground sinisio, which her mother would sometimes mix in with soups to act as a laxative. She sprinkled the powder over the bean soup, knowing that her mother hated that particular kind and wouldn't hesitate to pass it on to Naruto. She also fixed 2 more bowls of chicken soup, and set them on a tray. Then adopting her brightest and cheeriest smile, she carried the tray out into the living room and set it down, asking if anyone wanted appetizers before dinner. Without hesitating, and before Naruto could say a thing, Mrs. Yamanaka picked up the bowl of bean soup, and thanked Ino for making her favorite. Naruto picked up one of the bowls of chicken and thanked her. Ino stammered, then moved to take the bowl from her mother, who resisted and held the soup off beside her. "What are you doing?" asked the older woman. "What's the matter?" Ino was silent for a minute as both of the others stared at her. "Well, that was Naruto's soup," she said quickly. "I heard you liked beans, so I decided to fix you some." Naruto smiled widely, but then said, "Nothing personal, but beans and I don't mix well, if you catch what I'm saying." "But mother, I thought you said you hated bean soup," said Ino, looking away from Naruto. "I did, but I've very recently acquired a taste for the stuff," said Mrs. Yamanaka, raising the bowl to take a sip of the broth. Ino couldn't help but cringe a little, but then her mother stopped short. "It smells kind of funny, Ino, what did you put in this soup?" Ino put a hand behind her head and stared at the wall, and began to list off the ingredients, making sure to skip over the laxative. "Strange," said her mother, "I've been a gardener and florist all my life. I've come to recognize the smells of thousands of different plants, no matter how faint they may be, and I could have sworn I smelled something off in here somewhere." Ino paled, and put her hands behind her back, but kept smiling and said she didn't know anything. Her mother then set down the bowl, glared wickedly at her daughter, and told Ino to go dump it down the drain before anything bad became of it. Ino obliged immediately, and Mrs. Yamanaka smiled at Naruto. "What was that all about?" asked the golden-haired nin. "My daughter can be somewhat overzealous sometimes, and I'd guess that she didn't approve of when you said you humiliated Sasuke in front of the whole class," astutely reasoned the woman, standing up and politely excusing herself to the kitchen, leaving Naruto the only one in the living room. Ino sat in the kitchen rocking back and forth on one of the stools. The now empty bowl of once poisoned soup sat in the sink, completely rinsed out. "Why did you do that?" asked Mrs. Yamanaka quietly, and walking into the kitchen. "He's our guest, that means he's your guest too, and you decide to play a trick on him like one of those bullies at the academy. That was a cruel thing to do, Ino, especially after you wanted to invite him over." "Why?" Ino looked up at her mother and tried to find the words. She fumbled at first. "He was insulting Sasuke. He made fun of him in front of the whole class and—" "How many times has Naruto been made fun of, Ino?" interrupted a now angry mother. "How many times has Naruto been knocked down and kicked in front of the whole class? How many times has he had to run home because other children and even adults were throwing stones at him, simply because he crossed their path? Ino, how many times have you been the one throwing the stones, and what has he done to deserve it?" "He plays tricks on people," said Ino. "He makes a fool of himself and says all kinds of stupid things." Mrs. Yamanaka sighed and looked Ino straight in the eyes. "Ino, Naruto is absolutely starving for attention. Everyone ignores him, pretends he doesn't exist, and tells him to go away when he comes close. That wears on anyone, Ino, much more a 12-year-old boy. The reason he does what he does, is because it gets people to notice him. Even if they think he's stupid and an idiot, they still notice him, and to Naruto, even that scorn must be better than being ignored entirely." "But," Ino began to protest, then looked away. Her mother was silent, waiting for a response, but all Ino did was stare down at the textile floor, wanting to memorize every crack and chip but finding none in the faultless tile. "But she began to protest again. "Think, Ino," said the girl's mother. "How would you feel?" The room slipped into an uncomfortable quiet, a long and uncomfortable quiet, until the sound of a key rattling in the front door shattered the silence. "Wonderful," muttered Mrs. Yamanaka. "Father's home," said Ino, as both of them quickly left the kitchen and sat beside a very surprised Naruto on the couch in the living room. The door opened and a tall man with a sword across his back and hair only slightly darker than Ino stepped in. "I'm home," he began to say, but stopped short when he saw exactly who was sitting in the house. "Anoi," said Mrs. Yamanaka, beaming, and getting up. She walked to him and said, "They have a guest." Anoi drew the sword and said he could clearly see that. Naruto's eyes widened in horror as he pushed himself back into the couch. "Amy," he said loudly and gruffly, shuffling his wife to the side, "what is that monster doing in my house?" Mrs. Yamanaka immediately stepped in front of him and put her hands on his shoulders. Ino and I thought it would be nice to have Naruto over for dinner, seeing as how he passed his final exam at the academy with flying colors. What? Growled Kensai. You, he said pointing at Ino, invited that beast over. Yes I did father, said Ino getting up and trying to be as placating as possible, leaving a frozen Naruto on the couch. I mean why not? What did he do for us not to be hospitable? Mrs. Yamanaka briefly glanced over at her daughter and smiled, then turned her attention back to her husband. What did he do? Echoed Anoi furiously. What did he do? What about everything he did to Konoha? What about what he did to our family? Anoi shoved Amy aside, and ran towards Naruto, pushing Ino to the ground and yelling for Naruto to get out. Naruto rolled away, just as the sword split the upholstery where Naruto had sat less than a second before. The blonde dashed for the open door and dove through, ducking behind a small tree near the house in the yard. He knew Anoi had plenty official training as a ninja. The Yamanaka father was after all one of the more feared, not respected but assuredly feared, Genin in the village. There was a loud thud, as tip of a wickedly sharp sword burst through the tree, and nicked Naruto's shoulder. He got up and sprinted down the street, dodging and weaving as he went to try and avoid anything else thrown at him. Anoi stood in the door, shouting and cursing. Stay away from my family and my house you little freak. You monster, don't come back. Ino was stunned. She'd never seen anyone actually try to cane Naruto before. Taunting and teasing were one thing, but this seemed unacceptable to her. Tears actually began to well in her eyes. What did he ever do to father, or mother, or me? She wondered to herself, nearly crying. What's he ever done to Konoha? SC. An hour later, Naruto sat with his back against the wall of his charred apartment. The remains of the doors to the closet had been braced against the front door and set in a hole Naruto had carved in the floor, making it virtually impossible for anything but a jutsu to break down the door. Naruto had sped out the nails left in the wall by the previous owners and used then to stretch one of his shirts over the window to keep out prying eyes. What did I do to them? He wondered to himself over and over again. Naruto, called a voice on the other side of the fortified door, accompanied by a knock. He recognized it as Ino, and cringed, fearing she'd led her father to him. Naruto, she called again. Listen, I'm not sure what to say, but what father did was wrong. I don't know why he is so hateful, and I don't know why everyone else is either, but I wanted to say I'm sorry for what he did. Naruto didn't answer, hoping she'd just leave, but he didn't hear her walk away, so he got up, went to the door, and looked through the peephole, just as the shirt fell away from the window, letting in the evening's orange light. To his shock, Anoi was nowhere to be seen, and it was just Ino, carrying a brown paper sack. She set the sack down, sighed and turned to leave, though after a few steps, Naruto unbarred the door and opened it. She turned around again and walked back as he leaned down and picked up the sack, reading, Ichiraku, on the side. Thank you, he said, half-heartedly smiling. Ino just stood there, trying to think of something to say, but nothing seemed appropriate so she elected to smile back. I'd invite you in and offer to share, he began, but, his voice trailed off. Ino shifted to look inside, and gasped when she saw the wreck his home had become. What happened? Gas leak, he said. She wasn't sure what to do now. On the one hand, she felt so much sympathy that she wanted to tell him that her mother wasn't letting her father back in the house, which was true, as was the fact that Mrs. Yamanaka hadn't put Ino up to any of this, and that he could sleep there if he wanted. But on the other, there was still something she didn't like about him. Maybe it was prejudice, or just not wanting to let go of her past dislike of him. He must have done something, she thought to herself. I hope things get better for you, she said, trying to sound as warm as she could, and turning again to leave. Thanks, he said quietly, and thanks for the ramen. My pleasure, she called back to him. Naruto turned around and stared into his home. What am I going to do now? He wondered. Ino turned around and saw him standing there, then tried to convince herself that he'd be okay and that things would indeed get better for him. But, she thought, no one will let him make things better for himself, so how will things get better if no one helps him? She turned around and jogged back to Naruto, who circled to face her. You know, she began, Mother kicked father out because of what he did to you tonight. Naruto seed his head off to one side a little. That wasn't very nice of her, he said. She didn't have to do that. No, but he deserved it. So what I'm getting at is that we have a spare room if you need a place to stay. Quarters would be a little tight, but we'd manage if you wanted to stay, and I'd be glad to have you. Now it was Naruto's turn to be stunned. Was she offering him a place to stay? You would do that for me? He asked. Of course, she smiled, forcefully putting any negative thoughts out of her mind entirely. Love to. Well, thanks, he faltered a little. Sure, thanks very much. Everyone needs a friend, Ino thought as they walked down the hall. That will be all for this video. Be sure to like, subscribe, share, and comment down below for more videos. Goodbye.